The envelope made a sound when it was opened, a dry, reluctant whisper like paper remembering heat. Its edges were soft from handling, the seal browned by years of candle smoke and the steady breath of rooms that no longer existed. Inside was a photograph heavy for its size, the kind printed on thick stock meant to last. It showed a family picnic under a wide elm tree, its branches spread like careful arms above them. Linen lay across the grass in a neat rectangle, corners pinned by porcelain plates that caught the sun in pale flashes. A basket sat open but untouched, as if even food waited for permission. The father sat stiffly at the center, shoulders squared, jaw set, eyes forward. He wore authority the way other men wore coats without thinking about it. Beside him, the mother's face was smooth and composed, a calm practiced over years of being watched. 3 children stood near her, hands folded, shoes clean, expressions trained into stillness. They looked less like children than small witnesses to something they did not yet understand. At first glance, it was a harmless image, the kind of picture archivists slip into folders without pause. Another family, another summer, another proof that time once moved more slowly. But the longer the photograph was held, the more the air around it seemed to cool, as if the image carried its own weather. Near the lower left corner, where the grass darkened and the light weakened, something intruded. A shadow, not soft like the elm's shade, not broken by leaves or shaped by wind. This shadow was heavier, more defined. It stretched across the ground at an angle that did not match the sun's position. It belonged to no body in the frame. It rose like a fourth adult, standing just beyond the edge of the photograph, tall enough to be seen but not invited to be present. Its outline was uneven, as if its edges could not decide where to stop. Once noticed, it refused to be unseen. The eye returned to it again and again, tracing its length, searching for a source that was not there. The photograph did not explain it, it only held it. The shadow did not move, but it watched, and with every second spent looking, the sense grew that the picture was not capturing a moment but preserving a silence. The town ledger spoke plainly. The family was listed as respectable, reliable, unremarkable. Church donors, landowners, names that appeared often in neat columns tied to repairs, contributions, votes. Their land sat just outside town, wide enough to employ hands when needed. Seasonal laborers came and went, their presence marked briefly in payroll books before being crossed out and forgotten. Names written lightly, as if no one expected them to last. This picnic took place on that land, under the elm that stood near the boundary line where fields met trees and work ended for the day. It was a place of rest for some and exhaustion for others. The photograph was taken in late summer of 1913, a detail confirmed by the length of the shadows and the clothing worn. It was taken only weeks before a line appeared in another ledger, smaller, easier to miss. A dismissal. No reason given, just a date and a name. A young farm assistant, paid regularly until that moment, then erased. After that entry, the name never appeared again. No transfer, no relocation, no death recorded, just absence. The photograph lingered not because of what it showed, but because of what it refused to explain. Some absences, it seemed, were not empty at all. In the early years, the photograph hung in the family parlor. Visitors sat beneath it, unaware of its weight. They commented on the children's posture, the fine condition of the lawn, the mother's composed smile. No one mentioned the shadow. Either they did not see it or they chose not to. In those rooms, silence was a form of order. Questions disrupted it. The father's authority extended beyond his land and into the spaces between words. His voice decided which topics lived and which were left to starve. The photograph, framed and cleaned weekly, became part of the room's furniture. It watched conversations rise and fall. It heard prayers spoken with confidence. It absorbed the sound of laughter that never quite reached the corners. Outside, the elm tree continued to stand, its roots deep in soil that had known many feet. Some nights neighbors said the ground near it felt uneven, as if it shifted when walked upon. Grass there grew darker, thicker, more stubborn. Animals avoided it when they could. These were small observations, easily dismissed, nothing that demanded ink. Time moved forward as it always does, carrying people away from moments they do not want to examine. Children grew. The mother's calm hardened into routine. The father aged into his position, his posture unchanged even as his hair thinned. The photograph remained. Dust gathered on its frame, then was wiped away. Years later, when the house was sold and its contents sorted, the photograph was wrapped carefully and placed back into an envelope, as if someone understood it should not be thrown away. It passed through hands that did not know its story, then into a box labeled simply miscellaneous. There it waited again, patient as only objects can be. When it was finally rediscovered by an archivist cataloging estate materials, it was handled without ceremony. Another image, another family, another date, until the shadow was noticed, until the eye paused and the breath caught just slightly. The archivist held the photograph closer to the window. The shadow deepened, gaining shape. It did not explain itself. It did not need to. The ledger was consulted, names matched, dates aligned. The dismissal stood out now, no longer just a line, but a wound. Questions formed quietly. They were not accusations, they were invitations to look again. The land records were reviewed. The tree's location marked on an old map. Testimonies were not found, but patterns were. The photograph became more than an image. It became a fragment of a larger absence. The shadow, once ignored, now demanded context. It asked what stood just outside the frame. It asked who was present but not permitted to appear. It asked why some stories were preserved while others were pressed flat and hidden between pages. Holding the photograph, one could imagine the moment it was taken, the smell of cut grass, the weight of the camera, the brief command to stay still. Perhaps someone stood nearby, instructed to remain out of view. Perhaps someone lingered longer than intended. Perhaps something had already happened that could not be undone. The photograph did not accuse, it recorded. It held what the moment could not release. In its stillness was a tension that had survived decades. The family's faces did not betray it, but the shadow did. It reached across the grass, touching the edge of the picnic cloth, stopping just short of the father's polished shoe. It was close enough to matter, close enough to be remembered by the earth if not by the people. As the photograph was placed into archival storage, labeled and preserved, its silence deepened. It was no longer a private object, but a public one. Anyone could look at it now. Anyone could notice what had been overlooked. The shadow did not change, but the way it was seen did. It became a question suspended in time, unanswered but undeniable. The family's name remained in records, but now it was accompanied by a footnote, a small mark of uncertainty, the kind that grows larger with attention. The photograph did not resolve anything. It did not offer closure. It only suggested that something had been present and that its absence had been carefully arranged. In the quiet of the archive, surrounded by other images and papers, the photograph rested. It was no longer framed, no longer admired for its neatness. It was studied. The shadow remained. It waited, as it always had, for someone to understand that what is not shown can still leave a mark. And as the lights were turned off and the room fell into darkness, the photograph held its shape, its silence intact, carrying forward the knowledge that some moments refuse to end, and some truths, once cast, stretch longer than the lives that tried to contain them. The house moved according to rules that were never written down. They lived in the pauses between sounds, in the way doors were closed gently instead of slammed, in the way footsteps in the hallway could empty a room of conversation without a word being spoken. Order was not announced, it was assumed. The father's presence shaped the air itself. When he entered, shoulders straightened, eyes lowered, hands found something useful to do. His word was not loud, but it was final, and the town treated it as such. Reputation did much of the work for him. It wrapped his actions in a quiet protection, reinforced by neighbors who preferred certainty over questions. Looking away was easier than looking closely, and most people learned early which direction was safer. Servants passed through the household like seasons. Some stayed a year, some less. Their names appeared in the payment books, written neatly in ink that faded with time. Wages were recorded, hours tallied, small advances noted and then crossed out. One name appeared more often than the others, steady and consistent, written by the same careful hand. Week after week, month after month it remained. Then in late summer of 1913 it stopped. No explanation followed, no remark in the margin, just an empty line where a name should have been. The ledger moved on as if nothing unusual had occurred. Ink continued to flow, pages turned. To the book, absence was not a problem, it was simply space. Whispers, however, do not respect ledgers. They traveled faster and farther, slipping through kitchens and barns, carried on breath and hesitation. There had been a disagreement near the barn, someone said, raised voices sharp enough to be heard across the yard. Someone else mentioned a fall, sudden and awkward, the kind that left dust hanging in the air longer than it should have. No one claimed to see it clearly. No one wanted to. Details shifted depending on who spoke. A shove became a stumble. A cry became silence. Nothing was proven because nothing was pursued. In that era, silence had value. It kept doors open, it preserved employment, It protected names already written in strong ink. Those with less power learned quickly how expensive words could be. They learned when to lower their eyes and when to forget what they had heard. Silence was not empty, it was traded. Inside the house, routine continued without interruption. Meals were served at the same hours. The children were instructed and corrected. The mother maintained her calm, a practiced stillness that left no room for curiosity. The father's posture never softened. If he noticed the absence, he did not acknowledge it. The photograph from the picnic was placed in the parlor, framed carefully and set where guests could see it. Each Sunday it was wiped clean of dust, the glass polished until it reflected the room back onto itself. Visitors sat beneath it, sipping tea, remarking on the children's posture and the fine condition of the grounds. They spoke of weather and harvests, of church matters and distant news. No one mentioned the shadow. Perhaps they did not see it. Perhaps they chose not to. To point it out would have meant admitting that something in the image did not fit and that discomfort had consequences. The children passed the photograph daily. It watched them grow taller, quieter. They learned what questions earned approval and which earned looks that closed conversations. The image became part of the house's rhythm, as ordinary as the clock on the wall. Yet something about it unsettled them, though they could not name why. Sometimes one of them would pause beneath it, feeling watched without understanding the source. The shadow did not move, but it remained patient and unchanged, as if it had more time than they did. The mother never lingered there. She adjusted the frame when needed, her hands steady, her eyes careful. She did not speak of that summer. Silence, once established, becomes a habit. Outside, the land behaved differently. Livestock avoided the area near the elm tree where the picnic had taken place. Horses shifted nervously when led too close, pulling against reins as if sensing something unseen. Grass there grew darker and thicker, resisting the scythe. The soil stayed damp longer after rain, holding footprints that should have faded. Farmers noticed these things, but they explained them away. Poor drainage, shade, old roots. Practical answers for uneasy observations. At night, some neighbors claimed they saw movement near the tree, a shape where no one walked. Others heard sounds that did not match the wind. These stories were shared quietly, then laughed off in daylight. No one wanted to be the first to insist that memory could cling to land. Injustice rarely arrives with ceremony. It does not always announce itself with violence or spectacle. More often it settles in slowly, disguised as routine. It wears familiar faces. It hides behind the comfort of things continuing as they always have. That summer passed without bloodshed recorded, without sermons preached, without headlines printed. And yet something had shifted. A life had been interrupted, then erased. The house absorbed the absence, rearranging itself around it. The town followed suit. People stopped mentioning the name that no longer appeared in the ledger. Children grew up without knowing why certain topics felt heavy. Memory thinned, then hardened, becoming something people sensed without understanding. The father's reputation remained intact. He attended church, spoke when expected, nodded at neighbors who nodded back. His authority went unchallenged, reinforced by the shared understanding that stability mattered more than truth. The mother's calm deepened into something unreadable. She moved through rooms like a caretaker of quiet, ensuring nothing spilled or cracked. The children learned early how to inherit silence. They carried it into their own lives, passing it along without knowing its origin. The photograph stayed on the wall, unchanged, its shadow darkening only in certain light. It became a test no one took. Those who noticed said nothing. Those who did not were spared the choice. As years passed, the barn aged, boards warping, nails rusting. The spot near it where voices had once risen remained unremarked, though no one lingered there longer than necessary. The elm tree continued to grow, its branches thickening, its roots pushing deeper into soil that remembered weight and pressure. Seasons turned. Snow covered everything evenly, then melted away, revealing the same uneven ground beneath. The land did not forget even when people did. It held impressions longer than ink. It kept its own record, written in growth and avoidance, in the way shadows fell and stayed. When the father eventually died, his passing was marked with solemn respect. The town spoke of his contributions, his steadiness. The mother stood beside the grave, composed as ever, her expression unchanged. The children watched from a distance, carrying questions they did not yet know how to ask. The photograph remained in the house, still watching, still silent. Nothing was corrected, nothing was confessed. Silence had done its work too well. It had smoothed over the rough edges, made absence feel normal. But normal does not mean just, it only means familiar. Even after the house changed hands, the sense lingered. New occupants felt it without explanation. Rooms seemed quieter than they should have been. Floors creaked as if remembering different feet. The elm tree cast a longer shadow than expected in late afternoon, stretching across ground that resisted forgetting. The photograph, when discovered and moved, carried its weight with it. It was no longer just an image of a family. It was evidence of a choice made and reinforced by many. The choice to look away. The choice to protect order at the cost of truth. What happened that summer was not preserved in dramatic detail. It was not carved into stone or shouted in courtrooms. It survived in gaps, in habits, in land that behaved strangely. It survived in a shadow no one claimed. The injustice did not end when the voices stopped. It continued in the agreement to forget. And as long as that agreement held, the absence remained unfinished, waiting for someone to notice that forgetting is not the same as absolution, and that silence, once traded, always leaves something unpaid. The wall gave a different sound when the hammer struck it, a dull hollow that did not belong to age alone. The carpenter paused, listening to the echo settle, feeling the way old houses sometimes answered back. Dust hung in the pantry air, fine and pale, catching the afternoon light like suspended breath. The house had already been emptied of furniture and portraits, its rooms stripped down to wood and silence. It was being prepared for a future that did not know its past. When the panel was loosened and pried away, something fell forward gently, as if placed there with care. A folded letter, edges softened by years of damp and darkness, slid into view. It did not rush to be discovered. It waited as it always had. The envelope was sealed, though the wax had long since cracked and dulled. The paper inside carried the faint smell of mildew and old ink, the scent of something written in a hurry but hidden with patience. When unfolded, the handwriting revealed itself as careful and deliberate, each letter shaped as if the writer knew this might be their only chance to be precise. It was addressed to a sister in another county, someone far enough away to be safe but close enough to be trusted. The ink had bled slightly where moisture had touched it, but the words remained. Fear was there, quiet but constant. So were warnings. The letter spoke of threats disguised as discipline, of authority used like a tool meant to correct but sharpened to harm. It described a summer afternoon that ended wrong, an accident that was not an accident at all. The writer named the tree, the wide elm near the edge of the field. They named the shadow too, the one that fell where it should not have, the one that stayed longer than it should have. The letter did not plead for justice. It explained. It recorded. The writer admitted they did not expect to be believed. They wrote anyway, trusting that paper might endure longer than power. Tucked behind the letter was something heavier. A small glass plate wrapped in cloth that had nearly disintegrated. When held up to the light, it revealed itself as a photographic negative. The picnic image, reversed and fragile, emerged in ghostly detail. The family stood pale and inverted, their faces hollowed by the chemistry of preservation. And there, clearer than it had ever been in print, was the shadow. In negative, it did not soften, it sharpened. The outline was unmistakable. A face could be seen now, eyes open, fixed forward, watching. The carpenter lowered the plate slowly, as if sudden movement might disturb what it had been doing for decades. He did not speak. Some discoveries resist words at first. The letter and the negative were turned over to local historians, people trained to handle old things gently. They read the words carefully, tracing the lines where ink had thinned, pausing at names that matched those in ledgers and photographs. They compared dates. They held the negative to different lights, studying the shadow's edges, the way it intersected with the ground. Nothing in the letter contradicted the records, it filled them in. The revelation did not strike the town like thunder. There were no crowds, no sudden accusations. Instead, it moved slowly, like fog creeping across fields at dawn. People heard about it in fragments. A document found, a photograph re-examined, a story reconsidered. Conversations shifted in tone, then in direction. What had once been dismissed as rumor now carried weight, not because anyone demanded belief, but because evidence no longer asked permission to exist. Records were amended quietly. Margins were filled with careful notes. Dates were connected. The dismissal in the ledger gained context. The family name, once written cleanly and without question, was no longer mentioned without qualification. Not condemned outright, but no longer protected by omission. The past did not change, but its outline did. The dignity of the forgotten returned without ceremony. There were no monuments raised, no speeches given, just clarity. The shadow was no longer a mystery. It had become a witness, one that had waited patiently for someone to learn how to look. The sister named in the letter had never received it. There was no record of her reply, no evidence that she ever knew what had been written. That knowledge settled like another layer of quiet grief. The writer had trusted distance and time, not people. And time at last had kept its part of the promise. The house, once a place of controlled silence, had given up what it held when its walls were opened. Wood and plaster, weakened by years, could no longer keep secrets intact. Renovation had done what questioning never had. It had exposed the space where truth was stored. Those who studied the materials felt a careful responsibility. They did not dramatize what they found. They resisted the urge to make the story larger than it was. Instead, they let it be precise. A letter, a photograph, a shadow. Together they spoke clearly enough. The land was visited again. The elm tree was gone by then, cut down decades earlier after a storm. But the ground where it once stood still bore unevenness. Soil samples were taken not to prove violence but to document disturbance. Even without physical confirmation, the story held. It did not need spectacle. It had survived on patience. As the findings circulated, some people remembered things they had not allowed themselves to remember before. An odd silence that summer. A name that disappeared from conversation. A sense that something had been resolved without ever being addressed. Memory, once given permission, began to move, slowly, carefully. There was no satisfaction in this process, only recognition, the kind that settles quietly and stays. The photograph now accompanied by its negative, and the letter was placed in proper archival care. It was no longer just an image of a family. It was evidence of how power had shaped what could be seen and what could be hidden. Visitors who viewed it paused longer now. They noticed the shadow immediately. They leaned closer, studying its outline, its position. Some felt unease, others felt sadness. A few felt relief, though they could not say why. The image had changed, not in appearance but in meaning. It no longer asked to be admired, it asked to be understood. The house itself did not resist the truth. Once emptied and repaired, it became another structure, its rooms repurposed, its walls repainted. New families moved through it without knowing every detail of what had happened there. But something in the air had shifted. Silence felt different now, heavier perhaps, but also more honest. The kind that follows after a confession has been made, even if the confessor is long gone. The letter's writer remained unnamed in public records, identified only by context and care. That anonymity was respected. The goal was not to replace one erasure with another exposure, but to restore balance, to acknowledge without exploiting. The writer's fear, preserved in ink, had finally been met with understanding. Their hope that paper might outlast power had proven justified. Power had aged. Paper had endured. The shadow, once dismissed as an artifact of light, now stood as proof of presence. It reminded those who looked that what falls outside the frame can still shape the image. That witnesses do not always speak, but they do wait. The revelation did not offer comfort. It offered truth, which is quieter and more demanding. It asked the town and anyone who encountered the story to reconsider how easily silence is mistaken for peace. In the end, nothing was undone. Lives were not restored. Years were not returned, but something essential shifted. The forgotten were no longer invisible. Their dignity did not arrive through vengeance or outrage, but through acknowledgement, through the careful placing of facts back into their proper order, through the simple act of letting evidence breathe. The shadow, once hidden in a corner of an image, now rested in full view. It no longer needed to stretch or distort itself to be noticed. It had been seen, and in being seen it fulfilled the quiet purpose it had carried all along. Some truths do not shout, they wait. And some names, even when spoken only in ink and light, finally find rest once the silence around them is allowed to break. The archive drawer slides open with a soft resistance, wood against wood, a sound that feels deliberate even after hundreds of repetitions. Inside, wrapped in protective paper, the photograph rests beside the letter and the careful note that explains what was once erased. Light touches it only when someone chooses to look. Most days it remains in controlled darkness, preserved not as a relic of nostalgia, but as evidence of memory corrected. Time has slowed here. Dust is monitored. Air is filtered. Silence is intentional. This is where stories go when they are no longer allowed to disappear. The house no longer belongs to the family that once defined it. Ownership passed from hand to hand, each new name painting walls, replacing fixtures, erasing traces without knowing what they were erasing. Laughter returned to the rooms. Children ran through hallways that once demanded restraint, yet even as the structure changed, something subtle remained. People spoke of the house as solid but heavy, comfortable but never fully at ease. Floors creaked in ways that felt personal. Corners seemed to hold sound longer than they should. No one could explain it. They rarely tried. The elm tree did not survive into memory intact. A storm in the 1950s brought it down, its roots torn from soil that had resisted release for decades. The trunk was cut and hauled away. The land was cleared. Grass was replanted. Still, the ground never quite leveled. Locals noticed it when they walked across the field, a slight dip that caught the foot unexpectedly. Plows passed over it unevenly. Rain collected there longer than elsewhere. People avoided stepping directly on it without knowing why. Land, like paper, remembers pressure. Truth did not undo what had been done. It did not return years that had been taken or soften the fear that once shaped lives in silence. There were no apologies written into the past, no moment where suffering was made smaller by explanation. What truth did instead was alter memory, and memory is the place where history either rots or breathes. Before, the story existed as omission, a blank space mistaken for innocence. After, it existed as acknowledgement, imperfect but present. That shift mattered more than punishment ever could. The family's legacy did not collapse into scandal. There were no statues removed, no names scraped violently from records. What happened was quieter. Their name began to carry context, not condemnation alone, but caution. A reminder of how easily power settles into comfort and how rarely it is questioned until it is too late. In classrooms and local histories, the story was mentioned carefully, not as spectacle, not as moral theater, but as a case of what silence protects and what it costs. Power, once unquestioned, was finally examined, not because it shouted, but because it had left a shadow behind. The photograph made that unavoidable. Visitors who came to the archive often paused longer than they expected. They leaned closer, tracing the outline of the shadow with their eyes. Some felt uneasy, as if they were intruding on something private. Others felt sadness, a dull weight that settled without explanation. Few looked away quickly. The image no longer pretended to be harmless. It no longer functioned as decoration. It asked for attention without demanding it. The letter beside it was read slowly. People noticed the restraint in the words, the absence of rage. Fear had shaped the sentences, but so had clarity. The writer did not exaggerate. They did not accuse wildly. They named what they could. They trusted time more than people. That choice, once tragic, now felt deliberate. The letter had waited until someone could listen without trying to silence it again. Archivists spoke of the materials with care. They did not dramatize the story when explaining it to visitors. They let the documents speak for themselves. They understood that overstatement would cheapen what restraint had preserved. The story's power lived in its quietness, in the fact that it did not need embellishment. It existed because someone had refused to let it vanish completely. Outside the archive, life moved on. The town changed. Stores closed and reopened under new names. Roads widened. Fields shrank. New generations grew up without knowing the details, only the shape of the story, a photograph with a shadow, a letter found too late, a name restored not to fame but to record. That was enough. Memory does not require constant repetition, it requires placement. Once placed correctly, it holds. Some residents still walked near where the elm once stood. They noticed the uneven ground and remembered stories told half-heartedly by grandparents who never finished them. Those stories felt different now, less like rumors, more like inherited knowledge waiting for language. The land no longer had to carry the entire burden alone. It had help now from paper and light and careful hands. Justice, when it arrived, did not arrive as punishment. No one was dragged into public disgrace. No bones were exhumed. No verdict was issued. Justice came as recognition, as the simple act of naming what had been unnamed. A life that had been reduced to a ledger entry was restored to context. A disappearance that had been normalized was acknowledged as wrong. The absence was given shape, and in being shaped, it was no longer invisible. The photograph changed because the people looking at it changed. Once it had been admired for its neatness, its order, its suggestion of harmony. Now it was studied for its tension, for what it revealed unintentionally. It taught without raising its voice. It showed how easily an image can lie by omission and how truth often lives at the edge of the frame. The shadow, once hidden, now belonged to the light, not because it was illuminated, but because it was understood. It no longer needed to stretch itself unnaturally to be noticed. It rested where it had always been, fixed and patient, no longer alone in its knowing. Witnesses are rarely dramatic. They endure. The archive drawer closes again. The photograph returns to controlled darkness. It does not need constant viewing to remain present. Its work has been done. The letter rests beside it, ink still blurred, words still careful. The note explaining the context remains updated as understanding deepens. This is how memory breathes, slowly, deliberately. Some visitors leave the archive unsettled, others leave thoughtful. A few leave changed in ways they cannot describe. That is the quiet reach of recognition. It does not demand agreement. It only asks that forgetting no longer be mistaken for peace. The house still stands, though altered beyond recognition. The field still dips where roots once held. The photograph still waits. History does not end when truth is spoken, but it shifts. It stops decaying. It begins to breathe. And in that breathing space, something finally rests. A name returned to record. A story reclaimed from silence. A shadow released from the burden of being unseen. Because some names only find peace when the truth is told.